Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to essentially a rerun of our running successful process workshops. Hopefully, if you were at the last session or have seen the video, the YouTube video, we've made some updates and some improvements to some of the tips and tricks that we've included in here. Some of it based on feedback, but also just some of our own experiences of working with various teams mapping processes in live workshops. So what I want to do quickly is just touch on why do we use process workshops versus other approaches that are available. Perhaps one of the most important steps here that I want to talk about today is the actual preparation and setting up for a workshop, because I think if you really spend your time getting that right, then actually, unless something terrible goes wrong during the workshop, it should go pretty smoothly. For me, it's one of the most important things is the preparation beforehand. And we'll talk a little bit about some tips and tricks for running workshops, and then very shortly just touch on following up after you've run the session. So let's start with why run a process workshop. So as I said, you've got various approaches available to mapping processes, right? You could be doing one-to-one interviews with individuals within an organization. You might be translating existing documentation, so whether that's existing flowcharts or text-based documents or whatever. You may even do observation, so go out and walk around the office or the line and watch what people are doing, map the process based on what you're observing. Or indeed, it could be something you're doing yourself, your own process, just sort of sitting on your own, mapping it out to think it through. Now, or you can use a workshop. So why would you use a workshop over any of those other approaches? Now, there's various reasons. So I put a few of those up here, and it'd be interesting to sort of get your thoughts or ideas. I'll just go through these ones first. One of the reasons is you need input from multiple people, but you've got a limited amount of time. So if you think about that, you've identified, say, 8 stakeholders or subject matter experts that you need to work with to map a process. You certainly could go out and do a series of one-to-one interviews, and sometimes there's a very good reason to do that. But generally, if you're limited for time, if you're doing those interviews, you've got 8 people and you're spending maybe an hour or so with each one. That's 8 hours of interviews. So that's an hour each of their time, 8 hours of your time, plus you'll then probably have 8 to 16 hours worth of time afterwards tidying up what you've captured in those sessions and trying to merge it all into one view. And often, because you've talked to people all separately, they'll all have slightly different perspectives, which you then have to go back around everyone to make sure, okay, I've merged this in, does that make sense for you, and so on. So obviously running a workshop means you can get everybody into the session at the same time and get all of those different differences. So your workshop itself might be slightly longer, maybe 2 hours rather than 1, but you can then achieve a lot more in that time. Another good reason is where you are really focusing on trying to get agreement or consensus. And so that there's quite a lot of differences. And one of the purposes of the workshop is to get people together, talk about why they do it in a different way, and almost agree, okay, from today onwards, we're going to do it this way. Another really, really good reason, I think really powerful, is about using workshops to get buy-in and engagement. And this is about, again, it's about people working together and talking about the process. But the reason you're doing it is you really want people to feel like they're involved in the program or the change. I got a good example or story of where this was used that I was involved in. This was pre-Skore, but I was going to do some process workshops, and a client had asked me to come in to facilitate and map the process. And after a series of workshops, I was having a sort of feedback review session with the program director and the program sponsor. And they asked me how a particular stakeholder had been in the workshops. And I was like, oh, that person was great. I said, didn't have a great amount to offer to most of the conversations, but they were, they were good fun to have in the room. And when they did make some sort of observation, it was quite valuable and really useful. Why did you pick that person out in particular? And they said, well, that person is a really, really strong character. And they are very influential across the teams. And if they don't like something, they make it really known, and they're very disruptive and can block stuff from happening. But people sort of group around them. So we felt that it was really important to get them involved in those sessions so that they could buy into it. And obviously it was worked out very successfully. I just wish they had told me that before the sessions rather than afterwards, because it was lucky that it went well, but it might not have done. And the final point I made on here is typically when you're looking at a to-be or future state process and you've got decisions to be made, okay, if we're going to change the way we do this, we need to make sure everyone's agreed. We all agreed we decide what that change is going to be. So at that point, I thought just stop and see from you guys here, have you used workshops, and what was the purpose, or are there any other reasons that you think a workshop is a valuable, useful approach?
Yes, if I can jump in before everybody else. Yeah, they are useful. And as you've just said, having somebody from the awkward squad can be useful. But as you've said, it's always nice to know who the person is. Because often that they will say things that are not what the company wants to hear, but it's something that the company needs to hear.
Yeah, and that's often why they're awkward, because if you ignore them, then it looks like you're not addressing the root cause of the problems.
Yeah, that's why I like the awkward squad.
Yeah.
And just a little thing to add to that, really, people are maybe concerned or tied up in processes and not realise what the effect of whatever they've done, or why is it so difficult for their supplier person to do what they want from them. They don't have, the individuals don't always have the big picture, and sharing that amongst a group of people helps that kind of understanding, I think.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. One that, while you were saying that, James, it reminded me of another situation I see quite a lot in workshops. When you're doing one-to-one interviews with people to map the process, they're quite matter of fact about, right, I do this, and I do this, without questioning it too much. When they're in a group and then you've got someone saying, okay, well, what we do is we do this, this, and this, and then someone else goes, well, I don't quite do it that way. And then you open up this, okay, well, why don't you do it that way? Well, because I found a few years ago that if I do it this way, I save this much time, or it makes it easier, or whatever. So then they have that really interesting discussion, and then they all get agreement and go, well, I'm going to do it your way next time because it sounds better. So you get those sorts of benefits, which will often get hidden or take longer to come out if you do it as an interview type approach. Cool. Okay, I'm going to go back to our main screen. Okay, so now we know why we're going to use a workshop, or that we've agreed that we're going to use a workshop for this particular piece of work. Let's think about a little bit more about, okay, what do we need to do to prepare for it? So the first step here, I talk about agreeing the scope, but actually there's quite a lot in there in what I'm talking about. So I'm talking about, what process is it that we're going to be mapping? What triggers that process to start, and how do we know when it finishes? That's really the scope. Okay, when we're looking at this process, when we're in the workshop, we're talking about what's happening between these two boundaries, and that really helps conversations going off in different tangents. It allows you to bring people back and go, okay, for today's session, we're only interested in this. I think it's really important to think about who owns the process. Again, I'm sure you've all experienced in many organizations, there's often a lack of process ownership, or absence, or confusion about process ownership. So it might not be a question that you can even answer at this stage, but it's at least worth thinking about, or talking about, or getting people to think about it as you go and define the process. Obviously, you need to think about who needs to be involved in it. Often defining the scope first helps you think about, okay, what subject matter experts or stakeholders do we need to include, as well as the awkward squad, and so on. You need to think about where the workshop is going to be. Is it going to be in a physical location? And if so, are the participants going to have access to that, or they're going to require travel? Are we going to do it online? And more importantly, when, or as importantly, when are we going to run the workshop? So this is about setting up a lot of the logistics. The next thing we talk about here is obviously defining the purpose objective. Now, if you're running this workshop as part of a wider program or project of work, then obviously there's going to be an objective there. And part of that is going to be, okay, we need to understand these processes in order to be able to meet that particular objective. But the tip that I want to draw out here is it's something that we do internally, or as facilitators of workshops. We found it really, really powerful. If you might have an objective or purpose statement, but if you can turn it into a question that you pose throughout the workshop, it makes it a lot more concrete for people in the workshop to know, okay, what is it we've got to do here? What are we going to achieve? Now, I'll give you an example. An example one is from a team that I've worked with in the past, where originally they would go into the workshops and they were helping customers implement a new system. And they would say, okay, the purpose of the workshop is to capture the requirements for the system. Now, actually, what they had already done is they knew what system they were going with, and what they were actually doing was gathering information so that they could define how the new system was going to work. And so they changed the question to be, okay, the reason we're here today is we need to answer the question of what is the process we need to do, and what is the information or data that we need to capture to make this process work. And just by making that slight change and being a bit more specific about what they needed to know, meant that they could they would not only define the process, but they would think about each step. Okay, what specific data do we need to be able to execute that step? So are we capturing data from somewhere? Are we getting data that's already in the system? Are we reporting on it? Or do we need to enter or update and change data? And that made it then much, much easier for the technical team, who then had to go and design and configure the system, to know exactly what they needed to do. Another thing about the logistics, which I mentioned at the very beginning of this session, is if you're using a physical location, you've got a meeting room, and you're going to be projecting this onto the screen while you're mapping in the workshop, or even equally, if you're just going to do it on a whiteboard and sticky notes, whatever your approach is, go and have a look at the room. If you're going to use a whiteboard, make sure it's got a whiteboard. If you're going to be projecting this onto a screen, make sure there is a screen and it works. Your laptop connects to it. There's nothing worse than turning up at a workshop and you plug it in and the projector doesn't work, or you don't have the right adapter for your laptop to plug into the projector. So if you've got the possibility to do it, it's so worth, just for peace of mind, to go in and just check it all works the day before or a couple of days before. Equally, if you're doing this remote, make sure you're comfortable and familiar with the technology that you're using for the meeting. So whether it's Zoom, Teams, Google Meet, whatever. Again, if you're an external going into a company to do this, you might be very familiar with using Zoom, but actually when it comes to Teams, it's not something that you use on a daily basis, or vice versa. So make sure you're familiar with the technology. When you need to share your desktop, you know how to do that. Many of these platforms have other tools that allow you to annotate the the pages and so on and participants. And I've certainly had that in the early days of using Zoom, where I was presenting my screen and then suddenly like a circle or an arrow would appear on my screen and I didn't know where it'd come from, and it was one of the other participants trying to highlight something, which can come as a bit of a surprise. And then finally on there, it's about inviting making sure the participants know when it is, inviting them, sending them clear instructions about when it is and why they're there, why they're going. Okay, what I'm going to do is jump onto actually the running of the workshop. So just a few tips I'll highlight here. Really, really useful to do some sort of introduction at the beginning of the workshop. So whether that's just introducing the people that are taking part, but also reminding everybody of the reason that they're there. If these are people that have not been in a workshop before or a workshop of this kind before, very briefly running through the approach. How is the workshop going to work? What approach are we using to capture the processes? What sort of questions am I going to be asking? I also find it really useful to set some ground rules, simple ground rules like set your phones to silent, close your laptops. One person at a time speaks. Everyone's equal. What gets said in the room stays in the room. There are various things depending often on the culture of the organization or again what you're trying to achieve. I think we've got some examples that we've shared on the community before, the sorts of ground rules. Once you then get into mapping the process, I've found it really useful that I talked about that question, that you sort of turn the purpose into a question, have that clearly displayed on the page. Use our 5-step approach, because that provides a really good framework to guide the conversation, guide the questions, and help get people aligned. As you get more familiar with using Skore, you can use the shortcut keys because that makes it much quicker. So you can really achieve that mapping at the speed of conversation feel, so that while people are just describing the process, you're throwing up the boxes and they're going, oh, actually, it's not quite like that. It looks a bit more like this. And so you're taking away all the barriers and letting that conversation really, really flow. For those of you not familiar, there is a workshop mode in Skore as well, which I think you can look up in the help menu, where you can really maximize the real estate on the screen. So it takes away the top bar and it will make the browser go into full screen, so you really can just focus on the mapping part. One of the things that again over the years I found really, really useful is once you've mapped the process, is to do a verbal walkthrough of the process, whether that's the facilitator does that or you get one of the participants to stand up and do it. It's just often what could look like it makes sense when it's written on the page, when someone reads it out, it can often sound a bit ridiculous and everyone goes, well, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And so it's a really good exercise just to iterate back through the process and walk through. You'll undoubtedly find other things we go, oh, we've missed that, or I've forgotten to add that. And then the last thing, really, really important at the end of the session, is make sure you leave enough time to properly close out the workshop. And so that's all the things like, are there any, was there any conversations that we had to park? Were there any actions that we've identified that we need to do, like questions that were unanswered? Make sure you agree with everybody what the next steps are and who's going to do them and when they're going to be done by. Make sure you make a note of all of that as well, so you can share it with everyone afterwards. Make sure that everyone's going to have access to the software, to the processes. So think about how you're going to do that. And I always also found it really useful to make a note of who actually attended. So you may have a list of people who you've invited, but it's really important to also make a list of who attended, because any decisions that are made in the workshop about how the process is laid out, if you need to come back in future and talk about them, then knowing who was there is really useful. Just a little quick tip there on the pink box at the top I found is having snacks is always useful in a workshop, but try not to have loads of chocolate and biscuits and things like that, because if your workshop is 2 to 3 hours long and everyone eats a bunch of chocolate and biscuits at the beginning of it, you'll find in about 30 minutes you'll be sitting in a room full of silence because everyone has a bit of a sugar rush and then a crash afterwards. Found fruit and nuts are much, much better to keeping people engaged throughout the workshop. And then very quickly, just to finish off, I think if you've captured your next steps, then this is all pretty straightforward, but just a couple of things. If you're going to give people access to the process, make sure you've shared the link so they know how to find it. Keep people up to date with that agreed plan that you've made. And if you need to, especially if you have you've had a core group of people in the workshop, but there's a wider audience involved in this process, then it might be worth going out and asking for feedback from that wider audience on the process. And at that point, I will stop there and see if there's any questions or thoughts or suggestions, or any stories anyone would like to share from workshops that they've run in the past.